It's really common for the BA, BF, FG Falcons to have a leaking power steering fluid onto the alternators right underneath, and that burns out the alternators. So you're going to have to go and replace it with a new one, and it's quite expensive. I had that issue with this car. This car had a leaking power steering fluid onto the alternator. I had to replace that alternator, and I found over time it was still leaking. So I decided to replace the O-ring that was at the top of the power steering high pressure line. However, the O-ring that I used was a bit generic, it didn't work, and it kept leaking. So I decided to bite the bullet and got a brand new power steering line to give this a try, since it comes with brand new O-rings and brand new fittings. So I wanted to give this a crack. This video is for anyone else out there that wants to see what's involved, or wants to also give this a try to see if it fixes your leak. In this case, it actually did fix the leak that this car had. We did find the fittings were different from the original power steering line to the fittings on this brand new one that I'd ordered. However, in this video, guys, I'm going to show you the steps that were involved with this procedure, taking out the old one, putting in a new one, in the hopes that it helps someone one day. So please let me know in the comments if this video helps you out. For anyone that's new here, welcome. And for anyone that's been watching for some time, welcome back. Okay, to get started, we have the first point that we need to undo, which is underneath the power steering reservoir. And then the power steering line, it directs through into the engine bay and to the back of the steering box. So underneath the car, we're able to see this reference point, which is the alternator. It was quite new here. We'd only just replaced it since the old one had been burnt out. But if we look up right there in the middle of the screen, we're able to see that metallic part of the high pressure line coming from the top of the engine bay, following it through to the rubber section of that same line. It goes over the steering rack and then comes out here, bolting into the power steering rack itself. So we've got a 19mm nut to loosen, and it's this one here that we're needing to do. So again, remember guys, before you order your new power steering line, you need to make sure if you've got a 2 or a 3 bend version. So it's down here that you're able to look through and see how many bends you have on your car. So undoing that 19mm nut and backing that thread off, we're able to then pull the actual end point of this power steering line out and then catch the fluid that starts draining. There wasn't a lot, maybe only about a barely 50 mil that dropped out, but with that 19mm nut undone and that point of the power steering line removed, we're able to go through and start disconnecting at the top. So here we're just going to disconnect the high pressure switch. The little plug here is kind of spring loaded with this retaining clip. So removing the edges of that clip, you're able to then unplug that connector. Before we go and undo the pressure switch and also the top of this high pressure line, we're going to remove this rubber hose and the clamp that's holding that hose on, disconnect the hose and place a catch can into this power steering reservoir outlet. So that way we can catch all the fluid that's in the reservoir to avoid making a mess, but also to avoid the fluid dropping onto the brand new alternator that we just put onto the car. So chucking the catch can here, we're able to open the cap of the reservoir, and as soon as we do that, that allows the airflow and the pressure to eject out that lowest point into the catch can. I'd say about 300 mil or so of fluid ended up coming out of the reservoir, so it was a good idea to catch this fluid to avoid wasting the fluid, but also to again avoid it dropping onto the alternator. We can see that's about the level that it's dropped down to now. So now we can turn our attention to the top of the power steering line. We'll need a 17mm spanner to undo the nut at the top of that pressure line. So as long as you get a good firm grip here, we want to go anti-clockwise to undo the nut, and that means going towards the battery. Now, I found the nut was so tight I needed to undo the battery. There were 2 10mm nuts here to take the terminals off, and one 13mm bolt to undo the battery clamp. So with the battery out the way, I got a lot more access for my 17mm spanner to get in and loosen the nut here. So This one here, guys, is, I would say, easier to remove than it is to actually install. So if it's your first time undoing this part of the fitting and having to then later reinstall it, or in this case put a new pressure line and a new fitting, it's quite tricky on the installation side. You have to do it by feel, you want to avoid cross-threading. More on that soon. For now, we can take out the old one here, and that is the pressure line free from the car. Here you can see my generic O-ring that I'd attempted to fix the leak. That O-ring had disintegrated, hadn't fit properly, and it was still leaking. So make sure everything on the inside of that reservoir is removed before you go and put your brand new O-rings. I found in that packet of the new O-rings there was this little yellow cap, and that stopped the rest of the fluid from the reservoir leaking out ever so slowly. There was quite a bit of fluid that came out, almost 300 odd mils, I would say, of fluid that was in the reservoir. So now there's only one more thing holding this hose in place in the vehicle, and it's this casing that's holding the two hoses rigid. So opening that casing will allow us to free up the hose and remove the hose from the car. So we're able to start jiggling the hose now and carefully remove the hose from the car. And there we have it, one old dirty power steering line that we can go and compare to the new one to make sure it's as close as possible before we go and throw this one away. So comparing this one side by side to the brand new one, we see that it's a very, very close match. If we study this end of the power steering lines side by side, we can see that the pressure switch needs to be brought over to the new one. And there is one big difference. We can see that the coupling, or this nut insert that actually holds the fitting in place under the reservoir, is different between these two. There's quite a long shaft on the new one, whereas on the old one there isn't that same length on the shaft. Also at the back, we can see on this end of these hoses that go underneath the car into the steering rack, it's a very similar situation. The fitting line and nut is a lot longer than the original. In this case, I decided to go ahead to see if this would remedy my leak. So making sure I went and put a brand new O-ring that was supplied in the kit onto this part of the fitting, and then going through and getting a little bit of power steering fluid and lubricating the O-ring for good measure. Now this is the part that you guys want to be very careful when you're threading on the new fitting onto the bottom of the reservoir, because it isn't a very easy to access area. Trying to get this nut thread started, very, very difficult, and you want to make sure that it's going in hand tight and you're not forcing it in and cross threading the thread pitch, because it's a very difficult angle to get your hand access into. It took me probably 10 different attempts. I ended up getting it done off camera because it just took me so long to do. But just make sure that it's going in very, very easily, finger tight. You're not having to force it on with a spanner, and only tighten up with a spanner when you're sure that the thread has gone in correctly and you're not cross-threading. Now having a look, I tightened this up all the way that I possibly could, and there was this amount of the thread of the coupling still out of the reservoir. So in my case, I ended up getting lucky and it sealed and it didn't leak anymore. But I guess this fitting might actually be from another model Falcon, maybe a BF or another variant perhaps. We're seeing here a close-up of the generic O-ring that I'd put in place onto this original hose to try and see if I could stop the leaking. However, it didn't work. Obviously, that O-ring was incorrect and the fluid was still leaking. So, okay, so removing the pressure switch. I've got two 14mm spanners here, one to give leverage and one to remove the actual pressure switch itself. In hindsight, maybe it's better to actually do this pressure switch removal before you remove the old line, but I still managed to get enough leverage using the two spanner method and was able to start getting the pressure switch loosened with the spanners, and then the rest of it I was able to do by hand. So we can see here that the pressure switch itself just unscrews. It has its own O-ring as well, so careful not to damage it, but we can see there was so much crud, so much dirtiness built up around the base of this pressure switch, so I took the opportunity to give it a clean before I installed it onto the new power steering line. With it all cleaned up, remember you can go through and lubricate your O-ring, perhaps for good measure. I don't actually know if that's required in this kind of scenario. Maybe someone let us know in the comments if that's something that's required in this type of situation. Is it maybe actually something you don't want to do, perhaps? So let us know in the comments, but tightening this up here as tight as finger tight possible, and then doing the rest up with the 14mm spanner. Now, I found my spanner, guys, was too thick. It didn't actually fit to be able to tighten up that pressure switch. So I tried using some long needle nose pliers. They kind of worked, but I couldn't get enough leverage. So I managed to find these locking pliers, quite needle nosed locking pliers, and that did the trick. I was able to get the leverage I needed and the grip I needed to be able to tighten up this pressure switch. Moving now to the bottom of the car, under the power steering rack and the steering box, we're able to guide that hose through that little coupling and that little case and get that hose into its position, making sure to install one of the brand new O-rings that was supplied in the kit, giving it a lubrication, and then we're able to put the fitting inside the steering rack here. We can see a very similar situation again, where the threading on the insert was a lot longer than the factory one, or at least the last hose that was on here, but I managed to find that it's still sealed, at least in my case. So looking nice and new, nice and dry, we're able to go through, plumb up the rest of the reservoir with that hose, that return hose that we disconnected earlier. So removing our blanking cap, we're able to then put the hose on here and clamp that in place. Now I found that that yellow cap that I'd used to stop the oil slowly dripping out and making a mess had caught oil and had filled up all the way. So I removed that, got that out of the way, but we can see that it was kind of constantly dripping as we were going. So it was good to block that off. But pushing the hose firmly onto its position and then getting the clamp over here and tightening it up. With that done, we can move our attention to plugging on the pressure switch plug. And this harness here, it just pushes straight on. Nothing to it. You just got to get it around the correct way, and then it pushes down with a click, and those little spring retainer clips just lock it in place. Okay guys, so we're up to a stage where we can fill up the power steering reservoir with fluid. Now you want to make sure that you're using the correct fluid so that you avoid damage to your power steering system, and also avoiding as many leaks as possible. So here we've opted for the full synthetic power steering fluid that is suitable for these Falcon setups. You may want to use this opportunity, guys, to flush all of the old fluid out of the system before you go pour in brand new fluid. To do that, I've actually made a video on a step-by-step how to flush all of the fluid in these Falcons. I'll put the video link in the description below, so you can click on that and check that video out if it's going to help you flush your system. But from this point, we want to fill up to the maximum line with our power steering fluid and check for leaks. We want to make sure that there's no leaks occurring in especially the top and bottom thread points of the couplings, making sure that you've got a good seal, and it may be something you have to check over a few days to make sure and see if there are any ongoing slow leaks happening. So checking this return hose here, no leaks. That top connection, there was no leaks there. And looking underneath the car at where the final point of that hose connects to the power steering rack system here, we've also got it dry as a bone and no leaks occurring here. So that is great. Before we turn the car on, guys, we want to avoid sucking in as much air into the power steering pump as possible to avoid damaging the power steering pump. So to do that, we're actually going to go and spin the pulley for the power steering pump to force fluid through the system and force air out of the system. To do that, we're going to use a 3/4 ratchet or a 3/4 breaker bar to remove the tension on the tensioner so that we can remove the belt. So with an extension and a 3/4 socket, that's what I used to click into this special location on the tensioner. You'll find your 3/4 ratchet, just click straight in. I used this extension to give me more leverage. Pushing this in the loosen direction on the ratchet, you will see that the tensioner moves, and so does the belt. The belt actually loses its tension, and you're able to remove the belt from the power steering pulley. So doing that, we've now gained access to the pulley, so we can move that pulley freely and force the air out of the system as much as possible. So what we want to do is spin this pulley, so that way we're forcing fluid through the system and in turn forcing out any air that might be stuck in the system. Because remember, guys, your brand new hose has air in it until the system is full of fluid and all the air is pushed out. So this is an attempt to reduce damage to the power steering pump as mentioned, guys. Once this is done, we can turn our attention to putting the belt back onto the pulley. So we want to hold that tension on the tensioner, which then makes the belt slack. We're able to then put that belt onto the pulley of the power steering pump and put that tension back on the system. Carefully removing your breaker bar, or in this case my ratchet, and double checking that the belt is seated on all of these pulleys exactly as it's meant to. And not, out of place and falling off of any of those pulleys. So with that done, guys, we're able to actually turn the wheel left to right, lock to lock, to force more air out of the system. This is doing the exact same process that we did manually turning that pulley. However, with the wheels jacked up off the ground and turning left to right, we are simulating fluid movement from left to right internally in the system. So with the car running, we're able to double check and make sure that the fluid level is at the maximum line and not dropping, continually checking for any leaks. And with that done, we're able to turn our attention to putting our car back on the ground. So I've actually been using this 12-volt hydraulic jack. It's an amazing bit of kit. I was making a video recently on testing it over 6 months. So I'll put that link in the description below. So with some basic tools, this job can be done. Let's learn and grow together, guys. For anyone that has any tips, tricks, advice, please comment them below. As always, guys, please comment below what you want to see next, if there are any specific things that you'd want me to cover or want me to do. But as always, we want to flick something for good luck. So today we're going to flick this power steering reservoir for good luck. With that done, I want to thank you all for watching these videos, supporting me in my automotive journey. If you do want to support me further, I have a mobile business. If you can give me a follow and a like on Instagram and Facebook, that'll really help me out. As always, guys, let me know what videos you want to see next. Please take care, be safe, and I'll catch you all in the next video.